Lagos, Nigeria, a sprawling megacity where ambition is the ultimate currency, and the gap between the ultra-wealthy and those desperately trying to survive is wider than the Atlantic Ocean. From the 12th floor of her luxury penthouse apartment, overlooking the tranquil, shimmering waters beyond Victoria Island, Fiona Hart watched the city wake up. Lagos did not sleep, and it certainly did not wait. It was a relentless engine powered by generators, early morning vendors, and the distant roaring hum of traffic that symbolized the chaotic chase for survival and success. Fiona had spent the last 7 years mastering this terrain, transforming herself from a vulnerable, heartbroken young girl into the formidable CEO of Orem House, one of the most prestigious fashion empires in West Africa. She was elegant, fiercely independent, and wrapped in a protective armor of absolute control. Fiona hated unpredictability, she despised emotional chaos, and, above all, she loathed men who made promises they had no intention of keeping. Her life was mathematically structured, secure, and entirely self-made. But beneath the flawless satin dresses, the impeccably styled hair, and the pristine minimalist aesthetic of her office lay a deeply buried past. A past that she had meticulously tried to delete, block, and bury under the weight of her soaring professional achievements. On this particular morning, which happened to be her birthday, Fiona's strictly controlled world was about to experience its first microscopic tremor. Before her alarm could shatter the silence, her phone vibrated on the bedside table. Expecting routine notifications or early birthday texts from her loyal staff, she lazily pressed play on a voice note from Felix Wynne. Felix was the epitome of the modern Lagos elite: wealthy, patient, impeccably tailored, and consistently safe. For nearly a year, Felix had been pursuing Fiona with a gentle, non-threatening persistence, sending lilies to her office, attending her high-profile fashion launches, and offering the kind of stable, uncomplicated affection that her traumatized heart desperately craved. His smooth, amused voice filled the empty, luxurious room, wishing the most gorgeous woman in Lagos a happy birthday and promising a magnificent surprise later that evening. Fiona smiled, letting her silk sheets fall to her waist, as an uncharacteristic warmth spread through her chest. Felix represented peace of mind over reckless butterflies, and, after everything she had been through, Fiona believed that peace was the only thing worth protecting. By afternoon, the penthouse was transformed into a sanctuary of celebration. Smelling heavily of vanilla frosting, expensive perfumes, and fine champagne, her closest friends, Sienna and Brielle, had effectively taken over her living room, inflating gold balloons and playfully claiming a share in her massive success. Amidst the laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the dramatic off-key birthday songs, the conversation inevitably drifted toward Felix. Sienna, looking at Fiona with a mixture of affection and sharp intuition, asked the question Fiona had been avoiding for months. Did she truly love Felix, or did she simply love the safety and attention he provided? Fiona stared at the flickering birthday candles, her mind weighing the quiet consistency of Felix against the chaotic emotional storms of her youth. Before she could articulate her thoughts, the sharp ring of the doorbell interrupted them. Standing at the threshold was a sophisticated courier carrying an elegant matte black box tied with a heavy satin ribbon. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet under the bright Lagos sunlight, was a breathtaking diamond bracelet. Minimalist, incredibly expensive, and utterly tasteful. Tucked beneath the jewels was an anonymous card thanking her for simply being herself. Though there was no signature, Fiona's heart immediately credited the grand yet tasteful gesture to Felix. He was a man who knew how to celebrate her without making a scene. He was uncomplicated, and as she adjusted her sleek, form-fitting satin dress in front of the mirror later that evening, preparing for their dinner, Fiona told herself that she was finally ready to accept this uncomplicated love. When she stepped into the warm, humid Lagos night, Felix was leaning against his luxury vehicle, looking like an elite model from a high-end fragrance commercial. His eyes softened the moment they landed on her, and as they drove through the neon-lit streets of the island, the city lights reflecting off the windshield like scattered diamonds, Fiona felt a profound sense of security. They arrived at an exclusive, intimate rooftop restaurant overlooking the water, where soft jazz drifted through the air and the table was adorned with fresh white roses and scented candles. Felix pulled out her chair with practiced, protective chivalry, promising her a night where she could finally forget the burdens of her empire and simply enjoy being celebrated. For the first time in years, Fiona relaxed, allowing his undivided attention to wrap around her like a warm shield against the volatile world outside. Then, without warning, the entire atmosphere of the rooftop shifted. It was an invisible, violent change in air pressure, the kind of sudden stillness that precedes a devastating tropical storm. Fiona felt a tight, suffocating restriction in her chest before she even processed her surroundings. The low murmur of conversations at nearby tables faded into static. She turned her head slowly, and in that agonizing split second, time itself betrayed her. Standing near the entrance of the restaurant, sharper and broader than she remembered, but carrying the exact same devastating, steady gaze, was Calvin Pierce, her ex-fiancé, the man she had loved with an intensity that felt like oxygen. The man who 5 years ago had abruptly packed his bags and left for Canada, leaving her with nothing but broken promises, a shattered spirit, and a mountain of unanswered questions. He was the sole reason she had built the impenetrable walls around her heart, the reason she had thrown herself into ambition, and the reason she had blocked and erased every trace of his existence from her life. As Calvin walked toward her table with slow, deliberate steps, Fiona's throat went entirely dry. Felix, sensing the sudden icy shift in her demeanor, stiffened beside her and stood up slowly, extending a hand with controlled, territorial politeness. The two men stood face to face, Felix the embodiment of her stable, affluent present, and Calvin, the ghost of her unresolved, passionate past. They shook hands in a measured, firm, and intensely tense exchange. Calvin looked directly into Fiona's eyes, his voice low and raspy as he wished her a happy birthday, stating that he didn't come to cause a scene, but merely wanted to tell her how incredibly proud he was of the woman and CEO she had become. The word proud sliced through Fiona's defenses like a razor blade. Felix's jaw tightened, his hand resting possessively against Fiona's back, as he smoothly announced that they were just about to share a private birthday toast. Recognizing the implicit dismissal, Calvin nodded calmly, gave Fiona one last lingering, unreadable look, and walked away into the Lagos night. But the damage was already done. Calvin had not exploded her world with a loud confrontation. He had done something far worse. He had cracked the polished glass surface of her carefully constructed piece, leaving her gasping for air and realizing, with absolute terror, that she was not nearly as healed as she had spent the last 5 years pretending to be. The re-emergence of Calvin Pierce did not completely dismantle Fiona's life overnight, but it introduced a low, vibrating anxiety into her daily routine. Orem House continued to run with mechanical precision, shipments were delivered, and high-stakes meetings were executed perfectly. However, Lagos was a city where the elite frequently crossed paths, and avoidance was a luxury Fiona could no longer afford. True complication arose just a week later when her sharp, unapologetically forward PR manager, Chloe James, entered her executive office and placed a thick creative portfolio on her desk. Orem House was preparing for its monumental December collection, the most critical high-revenue campaign of the year, and they desperately needed a visionary photographer who could capture a bold, emotional, and narrative-driven aesthetic. Fiona flipped through the short-listed portfolios mechanically until her fingers froze on a page filled with raw, breathtaking imagery that mastered light like an unspoken language. It was Calvin's portfolio. In the 5 years he had been away, his raw talent had evolved into world-class genius. Chloe, completely unaware of the romantic history, strongly urged Fiona to hire him, noting his massive market value and the fact that he had briefly worked with the brand in its infancy. Desperate to prove to herself that she was a mature, unbothered business mogul who was entirely detached from her past, Fiona made a reckless, prideful decision. She looked Chloe in the eye and coldly commanded her to book him for the campaign, convincing herself that proximity would finally neutralize whatever lingering emotional ghosts remained in her heart. When Calvin walked into the Orem House studio 2 days later, he didn't carry himself with the arrogance of an international photographer, but rather with a quiet, comfortable confidence that infuriated Fiona. From the very first click of the shutter, the professional synergy between them was undeniable. They possessed an unspoken rhythm, a shared creative vocabulary that required no explanation. When Fiona struggled to articulate a specific visual concept, Calvin would instantly anticipate her thoughts, staging the lighting and models perfectly. But the professional ease quickly bled into dangerous, intimate familiarity. During long, grueling production hours and late-night drives back from location scouts through the suffocating Lagos traffic, The old versions of themselves began to bleed through. Calvin remembered exactly how she took her coffee. He recognized the subtle way she parted her hair whenever she was privately spiraling from stress, and he refused to play the game of cold corporate detachment. When Fiona defensively asserted that she was in a serious relationship with another man, Calvin didn't argue or display jealousy. He simply looked at her with an intensity that made her pulse race and uttered three devastatingly dangerous words. "I'm still here." The tension in the studio became a living, breathing entity, and it didn't take long for Chloe to notice. Chloe was an ambitious, highly attractive woman who operated with a predatory social instinct, and she openly confessed to Fiona that she found Calvin incredibly appealing, completely ignoring Fiona's icy warnings to maintain strict corporate professionalism. The spark that officially lit the fuse of this emotional powder keg occurred on a rainy Tuesday evening. Fiona was at home reviewing design sketches when her phone buzzed with a frantic screenshot from Sienna. It was a post from Chloe's personal social media account. A picture of Chloe and Calvin sitting intimately close at an upscale restaurant, laughing and sharing a dessert, accompanied by a caption that read, "Dinner with my favorite creative." A sickening wave of betrayal, humiliation, and deep-seated childhood fear crashed over Fiona. Her mind instantly filled in the blanks with the worst possible scenarios, convincing her that Calvin had returned to Lagos not to seek forgiveness, but to humiliate her, toy with her emotions, and replace her with her own employee. The next morning, the corporate facade crumbled completely. The moment Calvin walked into the studio, Fiona confronted him in a blind, fear-driven rage, accusing him of unprofessionalism, deceit, and playing games with Chloe. Calvin's patient exterior fractured. His jaw tightened as he defended the dinner as a harmless, strictly professional networking meeting that Chloe had initiated. The argument escalated rapidly, turning into a bitter battlefield of past resentments. Calvin accused her of always assuming the worst, of blocking him 5 years ago without ever giving him a single chance to explain why he left, and of projecting her deepest insecurities onto him. Blinded by pride and a desperate need to regain absolute control over her unraveling emotions, Fiona looked at the man she had once promised forever to and coldly declared that hiring him was the biggest mistake of her career, threatening to terminate his contract the moment the campaign edits were finalized. The real, catastrophic fracture occurred later that afternoon when Chloe walked into Fiona's office, completely oblivious to the emotional warfare that had transpired. When Fiona demanded an explanation regarding her inappropriate closeness with a contracted vendor, Chloe didn't back down. Instead, she boldly exposed Fiona's hypocrisy, pointing out that Fiona claimed to be fully moved on and happily dating a wealthy man like Felix. Yet she was acting like a crazed, territorial lioness over an ex-fiancé from half a decade ago. Chloe's words cut directly into the rawest nerve of Fiona's psyche because they were entirely true. Unable to handle the mirrors being held up to her own unresolved toxicity, Fiona stood up, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper as she told Chloe to pack her belongings and submit all company materials to the front desk, firing her effective immediately on the grounds of gross insubordination and corporate disloyalty. Chloe stared at her employer with a mixture of shock and profound pity, laughing bitterly before walking out of the building, stating that Fiona wasn't angry at her. She was terrified of her own buried feelings. The sudden, unjust termination of a top-tier executive sent shockwaves through Orem House. The office went dead silent, staff members whispered in dark corners, and Sienna called immediately, begging Fiona to explain how she could detonate her own multi-million-dollar business infrastructure just days before her own wedding over a toxic, jealous fixation on Calvin. Fiona sat alone in her massive, cold executive office as the sun began to set over Lagos, surrounded by magnificent campaign photos that Calvin had perfectly captured. She wanted absolute control, but as she looked at the wreckage of her friendships, her business, and her sanity, she realized she had achieved the exact opposite. She had initiated a chain reaction of emotional destruction, completely unaware that an impending, monumental revelation was about to completely upend her understanding of the past, testing her loyalty, her business, and her capacity for forgiveness in ways she could never possibly survive. The fallout from Chloe's sudden termination spread through the high-end circles of Lagos like a devastating wildfire, leaving Fiona isolated in her own empire. The moral ground she thought she stood on began to give way as the sheer weight of her actions pressed down on her chest. Inside the sleek, minimalist walls of Orem House, The atmosphere turned toxic with unspoken resentment. Employees who had once looked up to Fiona as a visionary mentor now kept their heads down, communicating in hushed, frightened whispers whenever her heels clicked down the marble hallways. They saw a ruthless dictator who would sacrifice a loyal, hard-working PR manager simply to appease her own personal, unhinged insecurities. But the true test of this brewing storm arrived 48 hours later, when the legal and corporate repercussions of her emotional outburst came knocking at her door. A formal, certified letter from a prominent Lagos law firm arrived on her desk. Chloe wasn't just walking away quietly into the night. She was fighting back. The letter outlined a massive multi-million naira lawsuit for wrongful termination without cause, breach of contract, and malicious damage to professional reputation. Because Fiona had acted entirely out of blind, jealous rage without consulting her HR department or documenting a single legitimate performance issue, Orem House was completely defenseless. The company's legal counsel sat across from Fiona with a grim expression, bluntly informing her that if this case went to trial, the public scandal would completely decimate the upcoming December collection launch. Investors would pull out, international buyers would flee from the controversy, and the brand she had spent 7 agonizing years building from scratch would be reduced to ashes. The systemic injustice of the situation burned in Fiona's throat. She felt trapped by her own hands, forced to realize that her desperate attempt to control her environment had left her completely vulnerable to ruin yet. The universe was not done squeezing her conscience. That very evening, as a torrential downpour slammed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Victoria Island penthouse, the doorbell rang with an ominous, heavy rhythm. When Fiona pulled the door open, she didn't find the safe, comforting presence of Felix or the frantic, dramatic energy of Sienna. Instead, standing under the dim hallway lighting, soaked from the relentless Lagos rain, was Calvin. His face was a mask of profound exhaustion and deep, simmering hurt. He didn't step inside. He stayed on the threshold, refusing to invade her space, but his eyes pinned her to the spot. In his hand, he held a sleek, encrypted flash drive containing the absolute final, meticulously color-graded masters of the entire December campaign. He had stayed up for 48 hours straight, working through a brutal migraine and equipment failures, just to fulfill his contractual obligation ahead of schedule. He placed the drive firmly on the console table by the door. His voice, when he finally spoke, wasn't angry or explosive. It was dangerously quiet, filled with the crushing weight of a man who had finally reached his absolute breaking point. He told her that he had officially signed off on the project, waived his remaining creative fees, and instructed his agency to terminate any future association with Orem House. He looked at her with a raw, piercing sorrow that made her breath catch in her throat. He told her that 5 years ago, he had left her to protect her from his own financial ruin, but coming back to Lagos only to realize that she had grown into a bitter, vengeful tyrant who would destroy an innocent woman's livelihood just to hurt him was a pain he couldn't bear. He told her that she had become the very monster she always claimed to fear. Before Fiona could find her voice, before she could utter a single word of defense or apology, Calvin turned his back on her and walked away into the dark, rain-slicked night, leaving her completely alone with her glittering, empty success and a crushing, undeniable sense of self-inflicted injustice. The next day, the antagonist of her present reality, Felix Wynne, decided to twist the knife even deeper, revealing the dark, predatory nature beneath his safe, polished exterior. Felix had caught wind of the brewing corporate scandal and the rumors connecting Fiona to her ex-fiancé. He didn't approach her with comfort. He approached her with cold, calculating leverage. They met at a secluded, ultra-expensive cigar lounge in Ikoyi, far away from prying eyes. The warmth and patience Felix had performed for an entire year vanished, replaced by the chilling arrogance of a billionaire who was used to buying whatever he desired. He slid a document across the heavy mahogany table. It was a corporate restructuring proposal. Felix offered to completely bankroll Chloe's legal settlement, silence the media, and guarantee the absolute success of the December launch through his vast network of political and financial elites. But his help came with a terrifying, suffocating price. In exchange for saving Orem House, Felix demanded a controlling 51% equity stake in her company and an immediate public announcement of their formal engagement. He looked at her with a smug, patronizing smile, telling her that a woman, no matter how driven, could never truly survive the brutal corporate waters of Lagos alone. He explicitly stated that she had a choice. She could either become his beautifully adorned, submissive wife and hand over her empire, or she could watch her life's work get systematically dismantled by the media and the courts. The sheer, unadulterated injustice of his ultimatum left Fiona physically sick. The man she had praised for being safe and consistent was revealed to be a calculating predator who had simply been waiting for her weakest moment to trap her in a golden cage. Her stomach churned as she realized the terrifying depth of the trap she had walked into. Facing the total loss of her identity, her freedom, and her beloved empire, while the villain of the story smiled warmly, waiting for her to break. The days leading up to the grand December launch of Orem House felt like a slow walk toward an execution. The vibrant creative energy that once defined Fiona's fashion empire had completely evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, paranoia-fueled silence. Fiona sat locked inside her dim executive office for hours, staring blankly at the legal documents on her desk. Alternating between the aggressive demands of Chloe's lawyers and the predatory contract Felix had left on her mahogany table like a waiting noose. Felix did not rush her. Instead, he applied pressure through a calculated, invisible siege. Suddenly, major textile suppliers who had partnered with Fiona for years began calling to report unexpected logistical delays. High-profile influencers and international buyers who had eagerly RSVP'd to the launch event suddenly began pulling out, citing scheduling conflicts. Fiona wasn't stupid. She knew the invisible hand of Felix Wynne was systematically tightening around her neck, demonstrating his absolute power over the Lagos economy, proving to her that without his protection, she would be completely crushed. He would text her every evening, always polite, always asking if she had slept well, always adding a smiling emoji that felt like a psychological dagger. He was celebrating his victory before the battle was even fought, entirely confident that her pride would break under the threat of bankruptcy and public humiliation. Fiona felt the walls closing in, realizing that her desperate drive for absolute independence had somehow led her into a trap where she would have to willingly sign away her life's work to a monster in a tailored suit just to survive. Meanwhile, secret operations were moving in the shadows of the city, completely hidden from Fiona's spiraling vision. Felix, believing he had completely isolated Fiona from any form of emotional or financial support, began to drop his sophisticated mask entirely when dealing with his inner circle. In the VIP lounges of Ikoi's most exclusive country clubs, Felix openly bragged to his wealthy associates about his brilliant acquisition. To him, Fiona was never a woman to be loved or respected. She was a trophy, a fierce, high-value asset that he intended to break, tame, and master. He laughed over expensive glasses of scotch, openly admitting that he had personally orchestrated the rumors surrounding Calvin and Chloe, utilizing his media connections to inflate the scandal and trigger Fiona's deep-seated trauma. He had intentionally fueled her paranoia, knowing her exact emotional triggers, waiting like a patient vulture for her to self-sabotage so he could swoop in as her savior and rob her of her equity. He even confessed that the breathtaking diamond bracelet he had sent anonymously on her birthday wasn't an act of devotion, but a calculated psychological anchor designed to make her feel beholden to his wealth. He was a master manipulator who viewed human emotions as mere coordinates on a spreadsheet, and the viewer can only watch in absolute disgust as his true, ugly face is exposed. A man devoid of empathy, driven entirely by greed, possessiveness, and a twisted desire for total dominance. But Felix made one critical, fatal error in his calculations. He completely underestimated the quiet, unyielding integrity of Calvin Pierce. While Felix was celebrating his impending victory, and Fiona was drowning in her despair, Calvin was silently orchestrating a massive, covert operation of his own. Calvin had discovered the true source of the supply chain disruptions and the coordinated media attacks against Orem House. Instead of retreating to Canada out of hurt pride, Calvin spent his days and nights pounding the pavement of Lagos, using his own hard-earned international savings and deep creative networks to uncover the truth. He quietly met with Chloe in a neutral location, presenting her with ironclad digital evidence that her Instagram post had been artificially boosted and targeted by a shell marketing agency directly funded by Felix Wynne's conglomerate. When Chloe saw how she had been weaponized as a pawn in a Billionaire 6 game to destroy Fiona and steal her company, her anger shifted entirely away from Fiona and onto Felix. Together, in absolute secrecy, Calvin, Chloe, and a fiercely loyal Sienna began assembling a massive, undeniable dossier of financial sabotage, corporate espionage, and psychological warfare. The tension builds to a boiling point as the night before the grand December launch arrives. With Fiona sitting alone in her penthouse, her pen hovering over Felix's predatory contract, completely unaware that the stage was being set for a brutal, public reckoning that would change the trajectory of her life forever. The evening of the grand December launch arrived, and the ballroom of the luxury Eco Hotels in Victoria Island was a spectacle of flashing lights, soft jazz, and the elite of Lagos society. Fiona stood backstage, her hands trembling as she adjusted the collar of a mannequin. She had not signed Felix's contract yet, but she felt the absolute weight of defeat pressing against her spine. Felix walked into the dressing area, looking entirely victorious in a bespoke tuxedo, sliding his hand confidently around her waist as he whispered that tonight would be the night she officially announced their partnership and engagement to the press. He smiled, completely assured that he had won. But as the fashion show concluded to a standing ovation and Fiona stepped onto the runway to give her executive speech, the massive digital screen behind her did not display the brand's logo. Instead, the lights in the ballroom suddenly dropped, and the screen flashed to life with a roaring hum. Images, bank transaction receipts, and encrypted audio recordings began to play across the screen, echoing through the premium sound system. It was Felix's voice, clear and boastful, detailing exactly how he had manipulated the supply chains, paid off media houses to create the Chloe scandal, and explicitly stating that he was going to break Fiona and steal her life's work. The entire audience gasped in absolute horror. The atmosphere in the room flipped from high society elegance to a courtroom of public execution. Felix's smug, patronizing smile vanished instantly, replaced by a pale, sweat-slicked mask of pure panic. He looked around the room as hundreds of phones were raised, recording his literal undoing in real time. Before he could sprint toward the tech booth to shut down the feed, the side doors of the ballroom swung open. Calvin walked in, flanked by Chloe and two high-ranking officials from the Nigerian Economic and Financial Crimes Commission. Chloe looked at Felix with a cold, triumphant glare, while Calvin stood steady, holding a folder containing the complete digital forensics of Felix's corporate espionage. Felix tried to shout, trying desperately to justify himself, claiming it was a deepfake, screaming at the top of his lungs that he was a billionaire who couldn't be touched. But his voice cracked, his hands shook violently, and his absolute humiliation was total as his wealthy peers and business associates turned their backs on him in disgust. The police officers calmly stepped forward, clicking heavy steel handcuffs around his manicured wrists right in front of the flashing cameras of the international press. He was dragged out of the ballroom, stumbling over his own feet, completely stripped of his dignity, his power, and his untouchable status. As the security guards cleared the commotion, Fiona stood on the stage, tears of overwhelming shock and profound relief streaming down her face. The truth had set her free. Calvin walked up the stairs of the stage slowly, not with grand arrogance, but with the same quiet consistency he had shown throughout her life. He handed her the microphone. The audience erupted into a deafening, emotional applause, recognizing the ultimate triumph of justice over predatory wealth. Fiona looked at the crowd, then at Chloe, who gave her a reassuring nod of solidarity from the front row, and finally at Calvin, who had risked everything to save her when she was at her lowest point. The walls around her heart didn't just crack, they shattered completely. She realized that real love didn't demand control or ownership. It protected, it sacrificed, and it showed up when the world was burning down. Right there, under the brilliant lights of the Lagos sky, justice had completely prevailed, restoring her empire and her dignity in a single, shocking moment of pure exposure. The aftermath of that explosive December night rolled over Lagos like a cleansing tide, rearranging the destinies of everyone involved and proving that the wheels of karma, though they may grind slowly, grind with absolute crushing precision. For Felix Wynne, the fall from grace was total, public, and merciless. The ironclad evidence assembled by Calvin, Chloe, and Sienna didn't just expose his personal malice. It triggered a massive, systemic investigation into his entire business empire. Within months, frozen bank accounts, seized luxury properties across Victoria Island, and a high-profile corporate fraud trial stripped him of the very wealth he had used as a weapon of terror. The billionaire who once boasted about breaking a self-made woman was reduced to a cautionary tale, serving a lengthy prison sentence abandoned by the fair-weather elites who once filled his inner circle. He was left with absolutely nothing but the cold, echoing walls of a cell, and the devastating realization that his greed had engineered his own ultimate ruin. Chloe James used her vindication and a substantial voluntary settlement from a deeply apologetic Fiona to launch her own independent public relations firm, which quickly became the most sought-after agency in West Africa. The shared trauma and the ultimate triumph of truth dissolved the lingering resentment between the two women, transforming their fractured professional relationship into a mature, mutual respect built on a foundation of hard-learned boundaries and transparent honesty. For Fiona Hart, the victory wasn't merely corporate, it was profoundly spiritual. The shocking exposure of Felix's predatory nature and the relentless, sacrificial loyalty of Calvin forced her to dismantle the icy defensive armor she had lived inside for years. She finally understood that true strength didn't mean carrying the weight of the world entirely alone, nor did it mean hiding behind the illusion of absolute control. Orham House flourished like never before, its December collection gaining legendary status across London, Paris, and New York, not just for its exquisite craftsmanship, but for the powerful, redemptive story of survival and female empowerment that birthed it. 6 months after the reckoning, under a soft golden Lagos sunset, overlooking the very water that had witnessed her darkest nights of despair, Fiona stood hand in hand with Calvin in a quiet, intimate wedding ceremony. There were no flashing paparazzi cameras, no superficial societal expectations, and no performances of wealth. Just the raw, beautiful reality of two souls who had braved the storm, confronted their deepest fears, chosen to build a future together on a foundation of consistency, respect, and unconditional truth. As Calvin slipped a simple, elegant band onto her finger, Fiona looked into the eyes of the man who had stayed, realizing that forever was never a fragile promise. It was an intentional choice made every single day. This dramatic, emotional journey leaves us with a profound, undeniable truth about the human condition and the invisible laws of the universe. In a world driven by a ruthless chase for power, status, and material wealth, we often forget that the energy we put out into the world will always find its way back to us. Felix Wynne believed his billions made him an untouchable god, capable of manipulating human emotions, destroying livelihoods, and buying souls. But karma operates on a spiritual currency that no amount of money can ever influence. True wealth is not found in the numbers on a corporate spreadsheet or the diamonds wrapped around a wrist. It is found in the integrity of our choices, the loyalty of our actions, and the kindness we extend to others when we think no one is watching. Fiona's story teaches us that fear will always try to force us to run, to protect ourselves by building walls, and to assume the absolute worst of those around us. But true healing begins the moment we find the courage to stop running, face our past, and allow vulnerability to replace our pride. Life will test your loyalty, it will test your kindness, and it will often bring you to your knees through injustice. But if you remain anchored in truth, the universe will always balance the scales. Now, we want to hear from you. What do you think about Felix's ultimate downfall? Have you ever witnessed karma strike back in such a dramatic way in your own life?